Hi, today is going to be a little bit different. This is a special reward for pushing me past 5,000 subscribers. Consider this my thanks. So today we're going to delve into one of the darker and more twisted corners of the Warhammer universe, the Daemonculaba. If you're familiar with the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, you'll know that this universe isn't short on nightmarish tales and monstrosities. But the Daemonculaba, well, it's often considered one of the more gruesome and edgy aspects of Warhammer. Consider this a warning. Some of the details we're about to cover are rather disturbing, and not in a tasteful disturbing way, just outright disturbing. The Daemonculaba refers to a twisted experiment conducted by the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion, in particular under the supervision of Warsmith Honsou, and it is a part of a grotesque attempt to create new Chaos Space Marines at a significantly faster pace, using Adeptus Astartes gene seed, specifically pure gene seed stolen from the Imperial Fists. This horror show would take place on the demon world of Medrengard, within its dark and torturous dungeons, within Honsou's very own fortress, Kalan Gol. So what exactly is the Daemonculaba, you may ask? Well, it's a specific process which involved implanting the stolen gene seed into the mutated wombs of human females, though the term human wouldn't really fit them anymore, which left these twisted women filled with both warp energies and the biological experimentation of the truly sick and twisted. These individuals were left as nothing more than vessels for breeding fully grown Chaos Space Marines. And in the grand scheme, this project would ultimately fail, thanks to the legendary efforts of Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines and a small cadre of allies, who were on a daring mission to destroy this abomination. But the horrors of the Daemonculaba still remain as a testament to the depravity of chaos and the unholy extremes which the traitor legions are willing to go in their endless war against the Imperium. Now, if you're wondering why Chaos would resort to such grotesque and underhanded methods, since after all, they do have the power of multiple gods on their side, and even lesser demons aiding them. Well, it comes down to attrition. And as you know, Chaos Space Marines are indeed significantly long-lived due to being largely sustained by the warp and the time-bending shenanigans therein. But they can still die, just as easily as any other being in the universe. Regardless of if it's through the righteous fury of the Emperor's holy warriors, the ravages of time, or some vile Xenos got lucky. Eventually, all the legions need to replenish their numbers, and that's where the Daemonculaba would come in. This was a desperate attempt to grow their forces through unnatural means at a much higher rate. Meanwhile, Chaos cultists, though loyal, are often mortal men and women, humans either trained or tainted into the service of the dark gods. However, as with anything related to chaos, it only spirals into madness and heresy. While they are a storied and beloved chapter, it is important to address that at least part of the blame for the Daemonculaba's existence and the horror therein lies in the catastrophic failures of the Imperial Fists. Their failure in defending their gene seed stock, along with Honsou being derived from Imperial Fist stock himself, means that at least in part, the Imperium's inability to protect these precious resources has led to the tangential connections and blame to the very traitor Space Marines, which created such an abomination, to be laid at the Imperial Fist's feet. Now, it is not exclusively their fault, since the Imperium's inability to effectively monitor and maintain control over its vast operations, at least in part, is due to the structure of the Codex Astartes, as time and time again the Imperium's enemies have been able to exploit the disarray that comes from the many disconnected chapters relying on one another in more loosely and mismanaged ways. And the reason for the need of Imperial Fist gene seed is due to one of the more unsettling aspects of chaos, mutation and corruption, which fester and spread throughout the ranks like a plague. The gene seed, which is a sacred tool to craft the Emperor's true finest warriors, becomes tainted when in the hands of the renegades due to their very essence being filled with the chaotic energies of the warp. The already flawed and twisted genetic material of the Chaos Space Marines renders creating new Marines significantly more difficult, often ending in a grotesque example of an abhorrent creation. When implanting defective gene seed into unsuspecting aspirants, an already deadly situation becomes far more horrific. Take the Death Guard, for example. Before their fall, they already had an infamous reputation for being rather grueling and cold-hearted with their recruits. Prospective Space Marines of the Death Guard would consume foul substances. Unlike the Imperial fists eating the detritus of other Marines, these were toxins and concoctions which, strangely enough, match much of what Nurgle creates. This, along with the brutal process of creating Adeptus Astartes, led to some rather unfortunate circumstances for many an aspirant. But once they turned to chaos and pledged themselves to Grandfather Nurgle, these trials would become changed, shifted even. This all comes from falling into the heretical hands of the traitors, and it was worsened far more than it was prior to the end of the heresy due to the Imperium chasing the traitors into the Eye of Terror after the fall of the War Master, causing the Chaos Legions not only to abandon what little shreds of honor they had left, their reputations, and their souls, but it seems none of them foresaw the need to continue to make more Marines after Horus's fall. And this led to a myriad of techniques to create new Space Marines, including the rather strange and secretive methods used by the World Eaters, as the Daemonculaba is only one horrifying example of the many ways that these once noble warriors seek to continue their lineage. In some more extreme cases, you have individuals such as Fabius Bile attempting to circumvent the entire existence of Space Marines, creating a new design, one which is less likely to be corrupted by chaos, since the corruption is inherent into its design. Now, you must understand that the creation of Astartes is a very controlled and arduous process, to the point that it has become ritualistic even. And it is important to remember that each and every gene seed line, being derived from a different Primarch, requires varied processes and steps in order to properly create Astartes, requiring both untainted gene seed and the specific conditions for each Primarch's gene seed to be met, be it genetic compatibility, spiritual rituals. All these requirements must be met at time. However, for Chaos Space Marines, whose gene seed has already been corrupted by the warp, producing stable and functional warriors from a fallen Space Marine's progenoid gland becomes a near impossibility under normal circumstances. So Chaos Space Marines have found themselves often left wanting for recruits, especially since they can't really create them with as much reliability as Loyalist Astartes can, despite Loyalist Astartes having on average a rather low success rate in creating Space Marines. This has led Chaos Space Marines to relying on largely stealing gene seed from Loyalist chapters in order to create chimeric gene seed, passing on the traits of their Primarch while taking what they can from the Loyalists. And this has led to the creation of such beings as Honsou and many other well-renowned Chaos Space Marines. However, that is not their main source of recruitment. That comes from renegade Space Marines and those potentially disillusioned with the Imperium, or seeing themselves as being too worthy to serve the Imperium's small human overlords. However, only relying on one of these is not enough. So often Chaos Space Marines will go on raids, including an incident where the Night Lords unsuccessfully attempted to raid the gene seed stocks of one of the Ninth Bloodline. Suffice to say, it was a spectacular loss for the Night Lords. However, one of the more infamous and successful incidents of stealing gene seed involves the Iron Warriors successfully assaulting the Imperial Fist's reserves, resulting in a theft of a significant stockpile that would keep any Chaos Warlord well supplied for generations. This was not just an opportunistic raid, it was part of a strategy which necessitated said gene seed for their survival. Now, a question arises: what happens when this stolen, uncorrupted gene seed falls into the hands of Chaos Space Marines? And what happens when they attempt to use this material to bolster their ranks? One of the more well-known figures involving this is Fabius Vile, who is one of the most talented geneticists in creation, able to successfully have unlocked both the secrets of Astartes and Primarch creation. However, the claims of this are mostly for his own self-aggrandizement. While he can create facsimiles of a Primarch, he's fallen short on more than one occasion. However, he has been able to successfully produce new Chaos Space Marines using both stolen and corrupted gene seed at a rate successful enough to guarantee his safety, if you will. However, this gives him too much power. This is what caused the birth of the Daemonculaba, or a creation that would use uncorrupted genetic material in a rather gruesome process in order to make Iron Warriors out of Imperial Fist genetics at a much higher rate than even the Loyalists were able to. And it wasn't just an atrocity in terms of its results. It was a nightmare from beginning to end. Captured humans, often stranded within the Eye of Terror, becoming unwilling vessels, disfigured to the point that even the Imperium shudders at their grim fate. These poor souls would not know the release of death. Instead, they would be subjected to a nigh unending torment. The Daemonculaba is regarded by many, if not most, as the single most abhorrent fate in the 41st millennium. And while the grim darkness of the far future is filled with horrific and disgusting practices, few match the sheer depravity of this process. What awaits these victims isn't death, mutation, or even any comprehensible suffering. It is a very violation of the human's body, soul, and identity. From the moment they are captured to the final grotesque birth of a new Chaos Space Marine, the entire ordeal is a living nightmare, which makes death seem like a sweet, beautiful dream just out of reach. What led to the doom of the Daemonculaba was the legendary captain Uriel Ventris and his brother Persis, who had embarked on a grim journey, cast out from their chapter due to breaking the oath of faith within the Codex Astartes. They would now be bound by a death oath, a solemn mission to seek out the blasphemous creations hidden away by the Iron Warriors, and through this, Ventris and his brother would eventually find the Daemonculaba, knowing that it represented something even darker than even their most twisted of nightmares. Shrouded in the shadows of Medrengard, these abominations were the products of despair and madness, born from a realm far from the sight of humanity, and where only chaos reigned. Now the Iron Warriors were not alone in their depravity. There had also been the Night Lords, another traitor legion, one known for their brutal treatment of human captives, torturing them for their own enjoyment, drawing out the torment, the pain, the suffering, as much as humanly possible. Often they would flay their captives alive, as their screams created a beautiful music to their ears, a perpetual echo in the realm of the immortal chaos gods. It was on this planet, Medrengard, that Ventris and his fellow Ultramarines encountered a similarly nightmarish scene. However, this one was not crafted for the sheer enjoyment of it. As they explored the planet's surface, the Ultramarines stumbled across a ghastly visage, a raised platform with a grilled surface, and around it was the scattered remains of some rather ghastly event, making them originally believe that they had somehow run into a Night Lord's personal playground. Scraps of flesh, glistening fat, and other bodily fluids, all the remnants of a harrowing, intentional atrocity, one that would make the followers of Slaanesh blush. There was no mistaking it. Something unspeakable and unimaginable had happened, and suddenly there was a gust of wind, revealing massive sail-like sheets stretched thinly between poles. These grotesque banners flapped in the breeze, and they shifted and moved, showing their surface to be unmistakably leather-like, though far too large to have come from any human source, or at least that's what the Ultramarines hoped. Ventris and his companion, seasoned as they were to the horrors of the galaxy, were left with a sobering realization. These sheets were made from something far worse than any regular material. As they looked on in horror, they saw bizarre humanoid figures scurrying about beneath the sails, clad in what appeared to be rubber masks with round eyeglasses, as they scraped and cured the leathery hides. Though the nature of this grotesque material at the time was unknown to the Ultramarines, one thing was clear: they had uncovered something beyond the mere torture of the Night Lords. This was a scene of ritualistic perversion, much more befitting of the followers of Slaanesh, a dark process that seemed to defy all reason. This discovery on Medrengard only served to deepen the terror surrounding the Daemonculaba, as what they would meet were not just chaos-born monstrosities rend from the mountains of madness. Instead, they were products of a deranged, sycophantic mind, an inhuman creation of almost industrial scale, where they harvested flesh, despair, and corruption. For Ventris and his battle brother, this was a grim moment of realization, as they had come face to face with one of the most well-kept secrets of the Iron Warriors, and their unholy quest to create new life through this despicable abomination. destruction. But even as the Marines recoiled from this sight, they knew their mission was far from over. Deep within the heart of Medrengard lay their target, the Daemonculaba, where true horror awaited them. As the Ultramarines surveyed the camp, they quickly came to realize that the site was more than just a grotesque factory of human suffering with no end. It was actually guarded by a litany of iron warriors. Besides them were mutated creatures, poor souls who had been part of this horrific operation, which led to a brief and brutal engagement, nearly costing the Ultramarines their lives. However, they were quickly aided by a mysterious group of Marines, whose allegiance seemed to remain unclear for the time. And with their aid, they were able to clear the camp, slaying the traitors and the mutants alike. But as the smoke of battle cleared, the full tragedy of the scene struck them. These surviving human captives were huddled together, weeping and consoling one another, their frail frames weighed down by the grotesque folds of stretched skin. It was a pitiful, heart-wrenching sight to behold. These were not warriors or soldiers. They were unwilling victims of a monstrous process, all created from a mind most profane. Their bodies warped beyond recognition, trapped in living nightmares, barely even human anymore. As the Ultramarines attempted to make sense of the situation, they turned their attention to the mysterious Marines who had come to aid them. It was soon revealed that these were renegades, Astartes who, while they had abandoned the Imperium, they had not fallen to chaos. And while some renegades feel the grasp of the chaos gods, others, like these, walk a dangerous line, treading just shy of corruption, like the Knights of Blood, who, while disregarded by the Imperium and labeled as renegades, lived to serve the Imperium's greater goal. And it was quickly found out that these renegades had not come to save the lives of the tormented captives, but they had come to destroy the site, as they were uncaring for the broken souls left behind. At this action, the Ultramarines were horrified, seeing the callous indifference that these other Space Marines were showing. They asked themselves how could they ignore the suffering of these wretched former humans. However, this was interrupted by one of the renegades answering them plainly, explaining that most of the prisoners never survived long enough to reach the stage of skin harvesting, and those who did might as well have wished they didn't. All these survivors were doomed to a fate worse than death, regardless if they were extracted from this heinous place. And so the Ultramarines pressed forward further into the camp, following the renegades' suggestions to see for themselves the horrors that lay within. And what they entered was a dark and claustrophobic warehouse, which was the center of the site, in which the air was thick with the stench of rot, waste, and the ever-present feeling of human despair. Chains hung along the ceiling, and rusted mechanisms moved flesh back and forth, all coated in a grim oil derived from the very flesh that hung there. Scattered about were towering cages filled with grotesque masses, creatures, unfortunate though they may be, barely recognizable as once having been human. Each cage contained a bloated, swollen figure, their skin stretched taut, yet they were pale, as if they were a decaying corpse kept alive for a singular purpose. These unfortunate souls had been transformed, their humanity stripped from them, fed by tubes and machinery that kept them at the twilight between life and death. Men and women alike had been reduced to bloated, formless husks, stretched as if they were balloons, held captive in living nightmares that defied all comprehension. Some were in vegetative states, their minds mercifully shut down, utterly broken. Others, however, still clung to a pitiful semblance of humanity, their eyes hollow and pleading, locked into the Ultramarines, silently begging, praying for release. However, the sons of Guilliman could barely meet their gaze, even for a seasoned warrior like Uriel Ventris, who had faced the horrors of war and the madness of chaos time and time again. This was too much to bear witness. These were no longer humans. They were living abominations, forced to endure suffering beyond anything an Ultramarine could imagine. The sight of these tortured souls clinging desperately to any remains of life pushed them to the edge of their resolve. The unbreakable will of an Astartes could crack under this pressure, forcing them to turn away, to shut out the sheer horror, the abominations that these individuals had become due to those of their kind. But they could not look away. This was the work of chaos, the chaos that they had been sent to reap, to destroy. As the Ultramarines went deeper and deeper still into the heart of this nightmare, they stumbled upon new abominations. This time, women. These wretched wretched, damned souls seemed to have undergone a punishment far worse than the others, as their bodies were also grotesquely mutilated, but this time their bellies were grotesquely and disgustingly stitched together in a simulacrum of a medical procedure. Their flesh appeared to be stitched, hacked, and slashed into shape, as though they had endured a series of torturous medical procedures designed merely to tickle the fancies of the butchers who had gotten their hands on them. Even for the iron-willed Astartes of the Ultramarines, this sight was heartbreaking. It wasn't the bloodshed or the mutilation that pushed them to their limits. It was the grotesque nature of the prolonged suffering, which was so far removed from anything natural or even comprehensible. This was something that could not even be expected of a Night Lord. These warriors who had fought countless battles, slain beasts of horrors and nightmares, now were stuck in the bowels of a dark, foul place, which left them averting their gaze from what used to be humans. These images and memories would haunt them evermore, but their mission demanded clarity of mind and strength of will. Now they were determined to use this nightmare to push them forward, so they could discover the true purpose behind this sickening mouth of madness. The grimdark truth that was unfolding in front of them was painfully clear. The purpose of this grotesque process, the purpose of this grotesque factory was to force feed these poor unfortunate souls until their bodies became laden and swollen with fat, only to later extract every last ounce of fat and flesh from them. These bodies were ravaged and forced to gorge themselves until the brink of bursting. For those who didn't succumb to the sheer excess, the process would continue, stripping them down to a skeletal frame while leaving them encased in hanging folds of flesh. What remained was a nightmarish mockery of life. These humans, condemned to exist in a shadow out of time, a twisted nightmare, wearing their flesh like a grotesque cloak. The Ultramarines understood that these individuals had been reduced to nothing more than raw material for some unknown and sinister purpose. Fat and flesh harvested, bodies manipulated and mutilated beyond recognition. It was a grim reminder of the dreams of terror and death that awaited those who fell to the predations of chaos. And yet, despite their discoveries, the true reason and rationale behind all that they had witnessed remained just out of grasp. The Ultramarines were forced to ask themselves, what was the purpose behind these abominations? Where was the rhyme and reason to it all? The Ultramarines would then step outside, where they were met with a scene that they could only describe as the grotesque climax of what they had been forced to experience thus far. The wretched captives, barely alive, seeming almost like the walking dead, being paraded before them, their bloated bodies swollen from the torturous process forced upon them by the Iron Warriors, who had kept them barely alive, far beyond what nature intended. Their skin and flesh stretched to revolting proportions in ways that could never be repaired, and it was shown that they were set up in a manner almost like a butcher shop, where their flesh was about to be rent from them, then cured and tanned by the mutated assistance of the Iron Warriors. This caused the Marines to feel a rush of emotions which was nigh uncontrollable. They felt pity, revulsion, and an unrelenting fury towards those who had done this to humans. However, the question as to why all this was done still hung in the air. Even the renegade Marines, who had accompanied the Ultramarines and aided in the destruction of this hell-like camp, did not know what the true purpose behind these monstrous acts were. As they had observed the suffering, they had noted that only the Iron Warriors, led by Warsmith Honsou, had established such camps across almost the entirety of the world. The exact reason, however, they were unable to ascertain despite all their investigation. To them, it simply mattered that the traders held these places as being of high importance, and due to that, they had to destroy them whenever and wherever they could. Not a one could be left standing. Not because of the outright inhumanity being committed within such camps, but because it was something held in high import by the traders. As they left, the Ultramarines watched the camp burn, being purged by purifying fire, reducing the nightmarish sight to naught but ash. And even as they retreated to safety, the horror of what they had witnessed seemed to weigh heavier on them than anything they had previously experienced. Eventually, they would make it to the Renegade Marines headquarters. There they found a grouping of not only Astartes, but Imperial Guardsmen, who they themselves had learned the truth. And as they relayed said information, they found that it was much more horrifying than they had expected. The Guardsmen all hailed from the planet of Hydrocordatus, an all too familiar name for the Ultramarines. Hydrocordatus had once been a bastion of the Imperial Fists, a fortress world, one of the most heavily guarded, if you will. One which, by all regards, should have been nigh impenetrable. But much to the horror of the Ultramarines, the Guardsmen revealed that the world had fallen, and in the chaos, the Imperial Fist's gene seed stores had been stolen. The traitor Warsmith Honsou had been the architect of said treachery, ironically stealing from that which had lent to his own creation, and he had brought the stolen gene seed alongside countless Imperial slaves to Medrengard. Now for the Ultramarines the implications were clear. This entire twisted operation, these monstrous camps, and the Daemonculaba itself, whatever it may be, were not merely places of cruelty, but a part of a much larger plan that almost assuredly dealt with the usage of the stolen gene seed to create new Space Marines. And when the revelation hit them, it was quite shocking, as these malformed beings that they had witnessed and the atrocities certainly did not match with any Astartes creation process that the Ultramarines had been aware of. However, it made too much sense to be denied. Eventually, Uriel Ventris understood that they had to act, since the vast gene seed stores of one of the universe's most well-defended planets had been harvested and were potentially being used to create near legion numbers of Chaos Astartes. So he intended to gather the scattered and disillusioned forces of the Space Marines within this area who had abandoned the Imperium, and with this opportunity he galvanized them with a common purpose. He called to them, speaking with the authority of someone who had held the rank of captain, and with said authority he was able to clearly lay out the mission ahead of them. They were to mount an all-out assault on the Iron Warriors' fortress city, confronting the traitorous Warsmith Honsou directly, and destroying whatever vile schemes he had laid. However, Uriel would not lie to them. Honsou's theft of the Imperial Fist's gene seed was no mere insult, it was a catastrophic threat which simultaneously displayed the amount of power the Warsmith held. It seems that they understood that through the demonic powers of the Daemonculaba, Honsou sought out to breed a new generation of twisted traitor Space Marines, and if the effort succeeded, his ranks would swell to near legion numbers, and the galaxy would tremble under the might of the Iron Warriors once again. However, with that knowledge also came the understanding that this mission would likely cost them each and every one of their lives, and while many called him reckless, Uriel proclaimed that he had no more wish to die than any of them, and that he intended to bring death upon the enemies of the God Emperor. The renegades were now torn between a flicker for a chance of redemption and an almost guaranteed bloody failure and death. While this may be a surprise to the Space Marines, all those who know Guardsmen will understand how unsurprising the next action was. The Imperial Guardsmen would be the first to step forward and pledge their lives on this desperate mission. The renegade Astartes saw this and understood that despite being incredibly fragile by comparison, these men were braver than them and showed their loyalty. Not to be upstaged, the Astartes themselves swore an oath of loyalty to follow Uriel into the jaws of Cerberus himself, and with that, the slapdash group of Marines and Guardsmen prepared to leave their defensive position. There was no question, no lack of understanding of how outnumbered and outgunned they were. They understood that likely none of them would survive, yet in that moment they'd lived for something greater, and they were all too willing to die for something greater. They had a purpose and a singular mission that they would follow. They would storm the fortress and destroy the Daemonculaba, all the while slaughtering as many Iron Warriors as they could. And if God Emperor willing, they would be able to slay the architect of this horrific act of human mutilation, Warsmith Honsou. What had once been a disjointed group of renegades and survivors now stood as a united force, ready to take on unwinnable odds. As they now approached the imposing Iron Warriors fortress, they would discover a tumultuous and none too strange power struggle occurring within its walls. It seems Warsmith Honsou was embroiled in a conflict against rival Chaos Warlords, something that honestly is not out of the ordinary, even if they are from within your own traitor legion, unless you're a legend such as Karn the Betrayer or Typhus. Inside the fortress, the conflict had gone on to the point that the once impregnable walls seemed to falter. Now inside the fortress, the loyalist cadre found themselves thrust into a brutal struggle. Moraine Uriel, who was aided against Honsou, fighting with a ferocity born out of sheer desperation. They held their ground for just long enough to allow the remaining loyalists to press through the crumbling entrance. However, as they veered deeper and deeper still into the heart of the fortress, a palpable shadow seemed to spread across them. The fortress itself seemed to be alive with chaotic whispers that clung to them as it bored into their minds, sowing seeds of confusion, fear, and doubt. It loomed over them and around them. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was as if a shadow over Innsmouth. Hours passed, and yet the labyrinthine corridors seemed to defy all logic. They would eventually encounter an iron warrior by the name of Onyx, who had been dispatched in particular by Honsou in order to hunt them down, which would result in a fierce confrontation, with the tides unfortunately turning against the loyalists. Onyx would unleash his wrath with the brutal efficiency that the Iron Warriors were known for, as he ripped out the spines from at least 5 Marines with an ease that would make a conflict against the Custodes seem fair. Eventually, one of the Marines who had been attempting to hold back the Iron Warriors in an act that gave the rest of the Loyalists a chance to ingress upon the Iron Warriors' domain was able to swiftly impale Onyx through the throat using one of his weapons. However, unbelievably enough, the Chaos Warrior remained undeterred, fighting with critical injuries being sustained either by mutation or the vexing influences of the warp, leading to the Loyalists suffering heavy casualties. With their numbers now dwindling and hope seemingly fading, they realized that they were not just fighting against Iron Warrior Traitor Marines, they were also fighting against the chaos that seemed to surround them within this fortress. However, they would not just give up, as Uriel and his comrades would eventually find themselves captured and subjected to a brief interrogation by Warsmith Honsou. Unfortunately, this moment would quickly devolve into a far more grim fate, as they were slowly dragged deeper and deeper still into the recesses of Kalan Gol. Here, the Loyalists encountered nightmarish abominations, figures who had seemingly grotesquely been stitched together from multiple bodies, their faces and eyes obscured by copper grates. These warped entities seemed to communicate merely through guttural growls and rasps. As the group was taken further still into the underbelly of the Chaos Fortress, they realized the destination that awaited them. It was the same place where many of the captives had been taken, to have their bodies horrifically twisted. The figures who were doing these acts strongly resembled the Adeptus Mechanicus, but in a perverse and twisted way. They were dark Mechanicus, if anything. And deep within this chamber they were now in, they saw something. Cages, with beings reminiscent of those they had seen in the camps. They saw the surfaces of every wall lined with poor unfortunate beings. Here, the unfortunate flesh-bound beings who had once been human were grotesquely subjected to even further treatments, as they were fattened and drained, then skinned alive. The sheer number of cages seemed staggering, and they would provide enough flesh to cloak an army. The surgical tables themselves, filled with ramshackle medical equipment, things that should never exist, cluttered the space, creating an atmosphere of thick, viscous fluids and the stench of misery and dread. Eventually, the beings carrying out these procedures would identify themselves as surgeons of demise, declaring their intent to sedate and corral the captives, vivisecting them for purposes unknown. However, they assured them that their flesh would be harvested and repurposed for the nightmarish creations that seemed to lack any semblance to true humanity. Uriel would continue his journey into the bowels of this profane fortress, where the true horrors of his surroundings began to unfold. Inside the enclosures that now surrounded them, horribly bloated figures, swollen well beyond any semblance of humanity, were plugged into the walls, fluids coming in and out. However, one thing was clear: all of them had once been female, and their bodies contorted into near unrecognizable states. These prisoners even had their vocal cords removed, silencing what otherwise would have been an unholy, unending chorus of pain suffering, and anguish. Unlike the previous forms he had encountered, these victims exhibited a grotesque rippling across their distended bellies, movements hinting at something or someone contained within. The sheer size of these grotesque figures suggested they housed fully grown humans or beings of equivalent size, something too grotesque to comprehend, even for a space marine. In a chilling moment of realization, it hit him. These were the Daemonculaba, manifestations of the darkest aspects of the Iron Warriors' experiments. Within their swollen forms now grew entities, amalgamations of pure and corrupted gene seed, twisted into horrors that would defy the natural order created by the God Emperor. The sight was more than he could bear. It was a nightmare made manifest. The compounding misery of the fate that he had witnessed and the countless other innocents that he had tried and failed so desperately to save weighed upon him as if he were Atlas. However, he realized that even if they were able to end the actions of the Warsmith and escape this nightmarish fate, he would have to confront these unfortunate souls and end their existences. And even as he was stripped of his armor by the surgical monsters that had aided the Iron Warriors, he struggled. But eventually Uriel would find himself teetering on the brink of unconsciousness, as darkness would eventually claim him. But he would struggle against the dying of his own light, determined not to become another grotesque creation of Warsmith Honsou. Eventually, once he would regain his cognizance within the cage that he had been positioned in, he was met with a horrific sight. Bodies, which were once those of proud warriors, had been reduced to a gruesome slurry. And this was how the Iron Warriors had chosen to attempt to repurpose their gene seed. It was no ordinary harvesting, but rather recycling, in a process that fused stolen genetic material from the Imperial Fists with the twisted essences of the Daemonculaba and the Iron Warriors, creating new monstrosities, far faster than any Astartes should come into existence. As Uriel's gaze widened, he became acutely aware of the younglings being unceremoniously forced within the chambers of the Daemonculaba's bodies. These children, frail and terrified, struggled and attempted to fight against their inevitable fate. As they were fed to these hellish wombs, their genetic material mixed with the remnants of the traitor warriors in a corrupt transformation that would turn them into new soldiers, new Iron Warriors. Their innocence forcibly sacrificed in the altar of war for the Iron Warriors' survival. In a moment of dread and realization, Uriel would understand that he too was being moved closer and closer still to this Lovecraftian abomination, as he was dragged towards one of the disgusting fleshy chambers. His body moved against his will as he was fed into a warm and gentle darkness that would envelop him. As he heard the chatter and cries of the morticians who surrounded him, the cacophony of madness that had, as of now, sealed his fate. And they explained, in a disturbing matter-of-fact way, that he would die, for he was deemed too old to become an Iron Warrior. And then it struck him. He would not die in a battle. Instead, his existence would be ended, as the very essence of his being was being flooded by that of the traitors. As the darkness closed in on Uriel, he felt himself struggling against his fate, a fate that would transform him into either a corpse or another monstrous pawn in Warsmith Honsou's master plans. As Uriel now found himself trapped in a living nightmare, encased in soft, blubbery folds of flesh which pulsated with their own lives, whose own mutant growths shifted. All the while, a new numbness spread throughout his limbs as his consciousness faded away. Meanwhile, other Marines shared an equally, if not all too different, horrific fate. As they were clamped in place, their bodies dismembered, as they learned the grotesque truth about the skins they had seen on the mountainside. Those skins, which they had discovered, were meant to clothe the newly birthed Marines of the Daemonculaba. As it seemed, the creatures that emerged from the abominable process did so without flesh of their own, and it was explained that the flayed flesh was meticulously stretched and stitched around them, transforming them into the next generation of Iron Warriors. The failed newborns, it was also explained, known as the Unfleshed, were not spared, as most were repurposed into the genetic slurry that was fed into the birthing machines, while the few who did survive would be cast out into the wastelands, forged to scavenge and feed as if they were animals. As this was happening, Uriel was now languishing in his own torment, fighting against what was now a fragmented reality, caught in a labyrinth of lucid dreams and horrible nightmares. Each blink and each gasp flooded his eyes and his lungs with stinging fluids, reminders of his grotesque prison. He felt umbilical-like cords invading his body, burrowing deeper and deeper still, connecting with his nervous system, as the amniotic jelly poured into his mouth, choking any attempts at screams. All the while, each struggle was a futile effort, as the structures that bound him into this fleshy cocoon would continuously encase him to greater degrees. As a dizzying, skull-crushing headache pulsed through his mind, reality blurred into a haze of pain and confusion. As the weight of the predicament settled upon him, he could sense the dimming of his strength, the impending suffocation of any hope, and he knew time was slipping away from him. He had to act. In the state of disorientation he found himself in, Uriel was drifting between unconsciousness and the waking world. Mustering all the strength he could, he battled for his freedom, tearing at the organic threads binding him. The pain he inflicted upon his unwilling host was a torment he could hardly bear to consider. As he pulled himself free, gasping as foul jelly-like fluids poured out from him, the air itself was rancid and revolting, yet it felt clean by comparison to the claustrophobic confinement he had just endured. Yet the liberation he had so hard won was short-lived, as a mutated guard was taken aback by the sight of an Astartes bursting forth from the Daemonculaba in such a way, caused him to charge in a panic. With well-honed instincts, Uriel managed to dodge the creature's assaults, quickly disarming it and dispatching the threat with a brutality Ultramarines were rarely known for. However, the toll of this ordeal weighed heavily upon him, as he was now coughing and weeping. The raw emotions of what he had just done to a poor and unwilling human threatened to consume him, even as he slayed the mutated. Fueled by a reinvigorated sense of purpose and anger, Uriel dashed to aid the remaining loyalists, joining the fray that was already underway, as his brother Ultramarines and a former Raven Guard were now locked in a desperate struggle for survival. The bizarre Morticians had sustained heavy losses from these Astartes' resistance, and despite his rather weakened state, Uriel was able to charge into the chaos, intent on freeing anyone and everyone he could, as the Space Marines were not only fighting for their own survival, but they were fighting for the guardsmen who had been caught up in the struggle against this nightmare. Their only path to freedom lay by taking a dip within the disgusting surgical waste and the remnants of discarded Astartes bodies, which ran like rivers beneath the fortress walls. And they succeeded in entering these sewage-like tunnels, wading through veritable rivers of dismembered bodies and rotting organic material. Their desperate fight now driven more by a need to escape rather than a need for revenge. Meanwhile, Honsou, incensed by the audacity of these warriors to flee and the destruction of one of his Daemonculaba, had his anger intensified tenfold, as he observed the mechanical morticians, who were now in a state of shock and bewilderment as their captives had escaped. Eventually, the loyalists found themselves amongst a group of massive and grotesque mutated figures who were known as the Unfleshed, and the greatest of them the loyalists would dub the Lord of the Unflushed. It would later be revealed to Uriel that it was due to his distasteful confinement that eventually the Unfleshed would side with him. He would also discover that these poor unfortunate souls had set up a statue to worship, not of a chaos idol, but rather one beseeching the Emperor to watch over them. Eventually, Uriel was able to unite the band of warriors and the Unfleshed to attempt a second siege on the Iron Warriors' fortress. As they traversed through the terrain, some of the renegades attempted to sway Uriel from his seemingly damned quest. However, Uriel Ventris was an Ultramarine, so his will was unshaken. Having witnessed the plight of these poor humans who had been butchered by the Iron Warriors, he found no retreat, and eventually even the Unfleshed would agree with Uriel, stating, "The Emperor is clearly angry with the Iron Men. He strikes at them from the heavens. And unfortunately, many of the renegade marines that had joined them previously left, leaving only Brother Pacian and the Imperial Guard with them. And although he understood that the warriors who had left him had done so because they believed that they would be more effective in a long struggle rather than this desperate path that he had taken upon himself, one which he believed was part of the reason he had been given a death oath by his chapter master. He understood that they were true warriors of the Imperium and that they knew no fear of death, only a fear of dying ineffectually. However, those with him continued to press forth, making significant progress towards the fortress. However, they would be met with the distant echoes of battle as two titans, two great iron warriors, fell, leaving Uriel to ponder the outcome of the clash. However, he would get his answer rather quickly. He learned that Honsou had triumphed and ruthlessly crushed the assault upon his keep and slayed the enemy commander. In his ambition, he had sought to recruit the Iron Warriors of his defeated foe and tempt them with the promises of spoils derived from the gene seed that was fed into the Daemonculaba, essentially swelling his forces, making him an even more dangerous adversary to the Imperium. Eventually, they would find an Iron Warrior captured and being tortured by Honsou, who begged them to free him or end him. This led to the Imperial Guardsmen to question why should he be granted such an easy end, despite the torture he inflicted on so many guardsmen. However, in his desperation, Obex would reveal how he could aid them in defeating Honsou. After a moment of consideration, Uriel agreed to grant him the release he sought, and in return, Obelix divulged critical information and a hastily recounted narrative, as he spoke of a great demon entwined within the core of the fortress, an entity rooted and bound by bitter enmity. Obelix explained that the demon they sought to eliminate would empower the Iron Warriors loyal to Honsou's enemies, enabling them to seize the fortress. However, if they released the cornate demon of blood and skulls, trapped beneath the chamber, which was being used to maintain the Daemonculaba alive, the chaos and destruction it would unleash would cause a powerful psychic backlash that would obliterate not just the stronghold, but any remnants of the Daemonculaba held within. This revelation was critical and eventually was the path that Uriel chose to undertake, even though he understood that Honsou would likely survive the onslaught itself. With their resolve and a veritable army of Unfleshed behind him, Uriel and Pacians, along with the guardsmen, would successfully press on to fulfill their mission. Yet it seems that Ventress's fate had already been ensnared by the Daemonculaba's machinations. It seems that a portion of his gene seed and his memories had been extracted within that grotesque abomination, and said extracted essence would be implanted into an ultramarine created by the warp, a conflagration of chaos and loyalists' gene seed, known as a newborn, who would avenge the destruction of the Daemonculaba. However, this is a story for another time. As having survived, and it must be noted that having survived and fueled by vengeance, Warsmith Honsou, now his fortress destroyed, vowed to retaliate and get revenge on Ventress and the Ultramarines for thwarting his plans to create a new army of Iron Warriors, a legion that would make even Perturabo proud. However, through other means, he would by year 845-999 M41 create a warband of similar strength to that of which he had lost, and set out to assault the realms of Ultramar, in order to teach the scions of Guilliman a harsh lesson about the consequences of interfering with his ascension towards demonhood. And his most significant asset would be none other than the newborn, a mutated heretic Astartes, imbued with Ventress's own DNA and his memories. Everything that Ventress was, the newborn was as well, but twisted. One with a perfect understanding of the Ultramarines' command protocols and structures. Invaluable knowledge that it seems the Daemonculaba had provided them, but that is a story for another time.